Hello everyone. Now I'm not going to present a detailed analysis of Ofsted's performance against its current remit, so we can relax a little bit. But what I will instead try and do is provide some fuel for the debate that was mentioned in earlier presentations about the link between Ofsted's work and teacher workload and professional development. I'm going to do this with some pretty simple observations actually, mainly drawing on data from the OECD's TALIS study. And that was conducted between 2012 and 2014. England participated in 2013, and the data mostly relates to secondary school teachers, and here I'm focusing on classroom teachers across 36 mostly developed jurisdictions. So the headline that came out a good couple of years ago now, which we all know about, is that English teachers work a relatively long number of hours in the week. On average, full-time teachers in England reported working 48 hours in the sampled week, compared to an average of about 41 elsewhere. That puts us right near the top of the rankings on workload. Furthermore, in England, 38% agreed and 13% strongly agreed that their workload was unmanageable. And as DfE's workload diary service has shown since the turn of the century, this is not actually a new issue at all. It's been like this for quite a while. We think this is not just important for the well-being of teachers and other issues such as mental health. We think it's really important for teaching quality as well. The first way in which this might be true is that, as the left-hand chart shows there, work schedules are the most commonly cited barrier to obtaining professional development among our teachers. 60% cite that issue, and that's more important than other issues, even things like support from the school and funding. And that's a higher rate than in most other countries. But taking it the other way round, we also find that teachers who find themselves feeling like they're well prepared for teaching on various aspects like pedagogy and classroom practice are less likely to find that they're struggling with their workload. So this is a bit of a sort of vicious cycle, we think, and that's really important. We also think this will affect teaching quality via the selection of people into the workforce. Of course, people don't choose jobs on one aspect at a time. They will look at various things. Pay and working conditions and workload are both really key. What I've done on this chart here is take a section of countries where we've got the data for all these different issues. On the vertical axis, I'm looking at the relative pay compared to other similarly educated workers, so that's generally graduates in these countries. That shows that, as in most places, English teachers are not paid quite as much as other graduates on average. On the horizontal axis, I'm looking at the hours in TALIS relative to hours for the whole economy reported in a different source, that's a labour force survey. So those two sources are not quite equivalent, but they'll be equally non-equivalent across all those different countries. And what we see here is that actually England is sort of even controlling the fact that our workers in other sectors work quite long hours, their teachers are working quite a long time. So that's sort of a double effect of being slightly underpaid and also more overworked than in most other countries that we see. We think this is likely to contribute to retention issues. And England's got one of the least experienced teaching workforces in the world. So 48% of our secondary school teachers have got more than 10 years experience. That compares to an average of about 64% across the other countries considered. So that's really quite unusual. What we know a lot less about is how this affects teacher turnover. Now, if we have nice, competitive, well-functioning labour markets, employers will generally be competing for scarce staff. They'll be trying to offer them the right balance of things like pay and things like workload relative to their own sort of production costs and mechanisms. So what we should see is actually schools making quite an effort to ensure they appeal to teachers so they can attract the right ones and improve teaching quality. But what we find actually is that so many teachers put up with quite long hours, and a really important thing to note is that lots and lots of English teachers work very long hours and still say they love their jobs. Lots of people working in excess of 60 hours also say, I do not find my workload unmanageable. They are dealing with it, they are coping with it, particularly with the young workforce, which is what we've got. That shouldn't be too surprising, but the implications for the incentives of schools is really important. So this group in the blue part of our pie chart are teachers who do not find that their workload is unmanageable. Then if we take the other half and we split that into different groups, we see that actually half of the group who are finding the workload unmanageable still think that being a teacher is more advantageous than not being a teacher, and they wouldn't want to move schools even if they could. So actually they're struggling with their workload, but they're not particularly looking elsewhere, and they're not thinking about changing profession. Then there's one segment there, that yellow category, and those are teachers, and that is 13% of the whole workforce. And this is the group who are saying, I find my workload unmanageable. I think being a teacher is better than not being a teacher, but I'm looking to move school. And actually, that's not a huge number of people, considering how many teachers have got very high workloads and are struggling with it. So it raises a question of whether we've really got a kind of an internal to the school system functioning market of schools competing for teachers. So there aren't very many good international comparisons of teacher turnover. TALIS has got information on the total number of years teachers have worked as teachers and the number of years they spent in their current school. Now, as you'd expect, teachers that have only been around for 4 years can only have worked in their current school for a maximum of 4 years. So we'd expect an upward sloping relationship between the total experience as teachers and the experience in their current school. And this is what we see on average across the countries in the TALIS survey. Now, if we look at England, it's pretty similar. So our teachers have generally not spent less time in their current school than those elsewhere. That could be taken as a proxy to say we don't have a particularly extraordinary high or low level of movement between schools. That's particularly when you look at other generally high-performing countries in the survey. So there's actually quite a range. There really isn't a model whereby you have very low mobility between schools or high mobility and it's particularly effective. Japan and Korea have got very structured sort of career development systems that involves moving schools quite a lot. On the other hand, Shanghai teachers look like they stay put a bit more. So the point is, we could have more turnover between schools and it wouldn't put us out of line with what's going on elsewhere. Now, turnover between schools, according to recent DfE figures, has actually been increasing recently for the last 5 years. What we don't know is whether that means there's kind of more of a competitive market for teachers going on, or whether actually this is just a disruption caused by academisation and that sort of thing. But it's important to note that the NFER recently found that the wages of teachers who have left for another job on average were 10% lower than teachers who didn't leave. So lots of teachers out there are moving jobs because they are not happy with where they're working, what they're doing, and are willing to take a pay cut to see that change. Now, when we've had very rigid pay rules, it's actually been very difficult for them to do that and stay as teachers. That's why lots have moved to become teaching assistants and moved to other professions. With the introduction of pay flexibilities, it might be possible that schools start competing a bit more on wider aspects of the job. And I'd hate to say it, this might involve some schools saying we might offer nicer working conditions and shorter hours, but lower pay. When resources are scarce and budgets are scarce, that may well be actually an optimal outcome for what we've got. But I'm not going to presume that should be the case. I'm just saying that there could be movement in this market which might help in other ways beyond other things we might think about. Now, what do Ofsted do currently? Well, they don't have a direct remit for things like checking up on teacher working conditions and workload, but in some often indirect ways, they really should be looking out for staff professional development. So in the Common Inspection Framework, the effectiveness of leadership and management should bear in mind professional development in their staff, and they're meant to have a kind of looking out for a motivated workforce. Of course, if workload and professional development matters for people outcomes and for the course of teaching, then anything Ofsted does to really check up on those things should really be incentivising good professional development and healthy work-life balances anyway. But it doesn't have a really specific remit on workload, as we discussed earlier. So, what the evidence in TALIS suggests is that this doesn't seem to have really driven a really big volume of professional development going on in our schools. So here, firstly, for satisfactory and adequate schools in the survey, this is quite old data, so it's got the old labels, but I think it's still going to be relevant based on other data I've seen. For some categories of CPD, they asked how many days did you take in the last year. That includes things like courses and workshops, conferences, observation visits. For other aspects, they just asked, did you participate in it? So that's things like development at works, formal mentoring, qualification programs, and collaborative research and that sort of thing. So for a satisfactory adequate school, we had an average of 4 days on those sort of the sort of big items there. There's not an awful lot of difference across different Ofsted categories there. It certainly isn't the case that outstanding schools have been spending far more resources training their teachers, at least in formal development. And certainly when you compare it to other countries where our volume of CPD in formal settings is really, really low. So that's an average of almost 11 across the other countries considered, compared to 4 in England. If I plotted Shanghai on this, it would be about the top of that window, about 40 days. So, as has been discussed already, in terms of the work on workload, Ofsted's myth-busting is a really, really important step, and it's consistent with what we found in our study recently about what really matters in driving working hours. In TALIS, we didn't see big differences in working hours between different categories. So what we're not seeing is schools are only getting an outstanding rating by actually working their teachers longer hours every week. That isn't what the data says. But schools in the lowest category did have more teachers citing that their workloads are unmanageable. So this could be because the teachers are just different people, or it could be because the environments are less amenable to coping well with long hours. And very clearly in TALIS and in other surveys we've seen, most teachers think that Ofsted plays a role in driving their workload. And that's consistent with the workload challenge as well. And that's why Ofsted's recent clarifications are very sensible, and I think we can all agree, should be properly implemented, as Russell was saying, and not just put out there on the website and then forgotten about. But what if Ofsted would take a more formal role and were actually to try and check what is going on with workload in individual schools? Now, TALIS is not the data set you would use for this. What I'm going to do is just talk through a bit of a thought experiment. So we've got data from about 150 schools. It's got 15 teachers on average in each tiny little sample, and it looks at the hours worked in the previous week. What I've plotted here is the median across those different schools. So what you can see is there really are no schools who've got a median working hours that are less than 40. And actually, there aren't many schools that have got a median working hours that are over 55. So actually the variation between schools is not completely enormous in terms of the median. But when we look at the 80th percentile and the 20th percentile within schools, we see quite a big range. So that does reflect this is a single snapshot week in the TALIS measure. It's not a perfect measure. But we have to ask ourselves, would Ofsted be able to get anything better that would not kind of have them unfairly identifying a school as being a high workload school just by chance? Now, looking again at the question of whether or not you find your workload unmanageable, this is what the school-by-school comparison says. So we've ordered the schools by the proportion of teachers saying that their workload is unmanageable, and there is quite a range. You've got some schools there with just 20% of teachers saying it, some schools with 80% saying it. So perhaps this is a measure which is a bit better. So if you were to go into schools and ask teachers, do you find your workload a problem, you might be quite likely to spot some schools that have really got a problem and others that don't. But actually, if you just apply the same proportion to every teacher in the sample, you're going to get quite a range across different schools if you're working with small samples. Now, there is a bit of variation there, but it just shows that you would unfairly spot some schools and identify them as being a particular example of a high workload school just by chance if you're dealing with quite small samples, or with unbiased samples. Excuse me. Now, if Ofsted did more with its staff surveys, perhaps you would find a broader indication of what's going on and over a longer timescale. But you're relying on a lot of subjectivity there, and I think some more analysis of the way staff surveys work and what information they give you should be looked at before you ever sort of launched into some really hard accountability on this sort of thing. Finally, on professional development then, there are other reasons to try and avoid a really or rush into a really kind of hard check on this in schools. So for most subjects and topics of CPD covered, according to the TALIS survey, less than 40% of English teachers reported a moderate or large impact of CPD. So teachers don't often find that their CPD is that helpful or valuable, which is a real shame. But actually, when you think about the fact they're only getting on average 4 days of what you'd call formal CPD in certain categories a year, if so much of that is taken up with updates on the new curriculum and stuff like that, it's sort of unsurprising. And this is lower than other rates in other countries. But also, England's teacher, kind of surprisingly, don't often say they need lots of professional development. So this is across lots of different sort of sets of skills. Compared to high-performing countries, England's teachers don't very often say, I really need more professional development here. So if you were to walk into schools and start arbitrarily saying you must have this, you must have that, and measuring the days of CPD, you could risk some quite unhelpful outcomes. And actually, I think there were other changes in culture around professional development that need sorting before you ever did something like that. So, what do I conclude from this? Something really does need to be done on workload. I think what's being done now is in the right direction. It needs to be implemented. But I think it's a tough ask to ask Ofsted and short inspections to really do a lot more. Perhaps the first thing to look at is probing school leaders more on how they've delivered success and how they've improved teaching. Have they just changed which teachers they employ, or have they actually developed their teachers? Is a really key question. Check for the processes which would allow individual teachers to be identified as struggling with their workload and how they'd be supported. It varies an awful lot between different teachers and probably between different departments as well. And that's why middle leaders are especially important, because there will be particular parts of schools where there might be a problem and other parts where there probably isn't so much of a problem. And I don't think it's going to be easy to sort of pinpoint across the whole school things going on here. Check the understanding of the links between work schedules and what happens in a teacher's life, how much time they've got to reflect, collaborate, improve in the more informal ways that are really, really important, and ensure that improvement plans have a long-term perspective. Nothing about turning a school around within 1 or 2 years is really going to encourage long-term investments in professional development that are really important, I think, as Russell was saying earlier. And I think explore how staff surveys can be better used before relying on them for anything particularly kind of hard in terms of accountability on this sort of thing. That's it for me.
Peter, thank you and Joe very much indeed for two intriguing presentations on two very topical issues relating to school inspection. My particular thanks to Joe, whose birthday it is today. I don't know whether this counts as something that you would or wouldn't want to do on your birthday as a sort of data and education analyst, but thank you both very much indeed. We're going to take some questions now before Sir Michael's speech, and we'll take questions on both sets of issues. I know also that Sir Michael wants to comment on some of these issues in his own speech, and therefore I think the Ofsted response, particularly Joe's presentation, will come through that route. But any questions on either of the presentations that we've just heard? Goodness, they've obviously done a very convincing job. Oh yes, Dr. Leunig. And perhaps for those who don't know all of the individuals, people could give their role and organisation.
Tim Leunig from the Department for Education. Peter, I was struck by your variety of responses of teachers compared to those in high-performing countries about CPD, particularly the one on the top that said British teachers felt less need of subject knowledge enhancement. And obviously we can read that two ways. Either they know the stuff already and therefore don't need it, or they don't know what they do need. And I wondered whether the data allows you to go beyond that and look at schools that have high value added, low value added, etc. and see, because if we find the schools with low value added, also the teachers don't think they need subject knowledge, that's more worrying than if we find that the schools with the best results have this view.
Unfortunately, the TALIS data doesn't have, well, the one that DFE gave me access to anyway, doesn't have value-added data in it. We have key stage 4 outcomes and Ofsted ratings.
Can you, by the way, do you mind if I just interrupt 1 second? Can people hear Peter okay? No. Would you like to speak from the platform?
Sorry, the boring point is that VA data isn't in the data set I've got from the DFE. It also isn't an enormous sample in terms of schools, so you've only really got 150 schools to play with. So my urge to the department is make TALIS 18 enormous, invest loads of money in it, because you can answer lots and lots of research questions based on it. We did a report just on workload, but there are there's 30 enormous topics you could cover well with that survey if you've got a big sample of schools as well as of teachers.
Thank you, Peter. Any other questions either for Peter or for Joe? Right, in that case, due to your self-discipline, we are actually running slightly ahead of our agenda, and we're not expecting Sir Michael for another 15 minutes. So we will take our break at this point and then resume at about 11:10. And I think there will be coffee available just opposite, but we'll check up on that. Thank you very much indeed, and we'll be back at 11:10. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Um,